Hello, and welcome to our talk, What Jane Read, a look at two of Austen's favourite novels. I'm Jessica Bull, and I live in London, England, and I'm the author of Miss Austen Investigates mystery series, coming in 2024 from Penguin Michael Joseph in the UK and Union Square and Co. in North America.
And I'm Felicity George, although my real name is Elizabeth. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I'm the author of the Gentlemen of London Regency Romance series. The first two books are available now from Orion Dash, Hachette, UK. We are really excited to be taking part in Virtual Jane Con, a radically inclusive event for fans of Jane Austen.
And as promised, we're going to look at two of Austen's favourite novels, Tom Jones by Henry Fielding and Evelina by Frances Burney, to find out why she loved them, how they might have influenced her work, and whether they're still worth reading today.
Jess, you read Tom Jones or The History of Tom Jones, A Foundling by Henry Fielding. Who was Henry Fielding?
So, as well as being a writer and a dramatist, Henry Fielding was a lawyer, a magistrate, and a social reformer.
Quite a few jobs.
He was born in Somerset in 1707, almost 70 years before Jane Austen, and he was the son of an army officer. And while his mother came from a wealthy landowning family, he died while she was young. And his father had done well in the army. He'd fought under the Duke of Marlborough, but he was generally thought of as a bit feckless. And therefore, his maternal grandmother, sued his father for custody of Henry Fielding and his children and his siblings. Um, and she won. And once she gained control of the children, she sent Henry to Eton to be educated. And once he'd finished his education, Henry Fielding moved to London. I think he must have always had ambitions to become a writer and particularly a dramatist. So he moved to London and he composed and oversaw the production of numerous comedic plays in various London theatres, always with a strong satirical bent. So
So, yeah, just what is satire exactly?
So it's basically the use of humor to exaggerate and ridicule someone's vices. So enable to criticize them and call them to account, especially in politics. So
Right.
satire of governments and regimes is a great humorous way to catch people's attention and to criticize the government.
And satire of society as well, or social norms and conventions, draws attention to some of our sort of oddities or follies.
Exactly, which we know Jane Austen perfected in her novels.
Absolutely. She did.
So, Fielding came from a literary family. His sister, Sarah Fielding, was also a novelist, and she's credited with writing the first ever children's novel in English. And critics also think that she wrote some of the passages in Henry Fielding's early work as well.
I like that twist that it was Sarah, his sister, who helped Henry, the brother, because I feel like all too often we hear sort of critics and historians speculate that maybe, female writers were the ones who were helped by their husbands or their fathers or their brothers. So I like this story. I like
Yeah.
it that Sarah helped Henry.
And you'll also like that apparently Fanny Burney was an admirer as well. So she doesn't come
Of
out and
Sarah.
say it. Yeah, she doesn't come out and say it, but apparently you can see Sarah Fielding's influence in Fanny Burney's work. I've only just discovered Sarah Fielding. I haven't read anything by her yet, so I must do.
Yes, absolutely. I think I will as well.
So in 1734, Henry Fielding eloped with his first wife, Charlotte Cradock, and she is said to be the inspiration for Sophia Weston, who's the heroine of Tom Jones, who I'll talk about in a moment. So Fielding was distraught when Charlotte died, but he did go on to marry again. In fact, he defied convention by marrying her maid, Mary Daniel, who was pregnant with his child when they married.
Ah, Henry. Well, I guess at least he married her.
Exactly. Some of this attitude kind of comes out in Tom Jones, I believe. So
Right.
he was definitely a lusty Georgian, and he enjoyed everything that life could afford him. So
Hmm.
in 1737, the Stage Licensing Act, which was designed to prevent artists criticising the government. So I think it was Horace Walpole's government, the first prime minister, and they were very touchy about criticism. So they brought
Hmm.
in this Stage Licensing Act, and it effectively ended Fielding's career as a playwright and theatre manager because satire was his thing, that was his calling. And if he couldn't make light of the government of the day and what he saw around him, it was very hard for him to be able to write or produce anything. So at that point,
Absolutely.
he turned to the law, maybe thinking that if he couldn't get around the law, he'd have to join it. So he entered Middle Temple and he was called to the bar very quickly. So he qualified and began practicing as a barrister in quite a short amount of time.
Hmm.
But he never really made enough money to support his family. So he continued to write and supplement his income in that way. So he wrote various things, so fiction, plays, various bits of political journalism, just to keep the money coming in. But it was always a struggle. And it was actually while he was being held in a sponging house for debt that he performed the greatest act of literary trolling of all time. So, 6 months beforehand, Samuel Richardson had published his great work, Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, which is sometimes cited as the first novel in English, and it's a very moralistic tale about a young housemaid who resists temptation and is rewarded for it in the end. And so, just
Right.
6 months after this came out, Fielding published his novel, Shamala. So imagine that, just 6 months to write it and to get it published and to distribute it. And
Well, he
Shamala,
couldn't write political satire anymore, so maybe he could write literary parody.
absolutely. So Shamala, which is a hilarious literary
Yeah.
parody of Pamela, it's the greatest pun of all time, the sham Pamela, was a great hit and really helped financially. And after that, Fielding continued trying to write for the stage, and he even ran a puppet show from his own home with his wife Mary serving refreshments to make ends meet. Until he was finally appointed as magistrate, and he actually became the chief magistrate for London. That was when he really
Right.
kind of established himself. And he pursued that role with great diligence. So he may be known for his comedies, and he was certainly a very humorous man, but he took his role as magistrate very seriously. And he was the first to employ impartial constables. So constables before that were voluntary, but he appointed six. There were six originally to manage the whole of London. So they'd go out and break up criminal gangs. Um, and he wrote pamphlets, Henry Fielding, on ways to combat crime, especially violent crime, sometimes working with his brother John, who was also a magistrate and reformer. And it was
So he
during
had
this,
many different sides, like that
yeah,
he different areas in which he impacted
yeah.
Britain of the 18th century.
Yeah, it's funny because he had this, you can see the same interests are at play. And on the one hand, he had this really serious side. So he actually wrote a pamphlet
Hmm.
arguing for a great big workhouse to um, help reform the poor and like teach them apprenticeships and to help them find
Hmm.
their own way in the world. And on the other hand, he wrote these ridiculously silly, fantastically adventurous novels, which kind of look at the same things from two very different points of view. Um,
Absolutely.
so it was during this time when he was a magistrate that he published Tom Jones, which was so popular it ran to four editions in Fielding's own lifetime. But sadly, soon after he achieved this critical and commercial success, he began feeling unwell. So at the time, they said he had dropsy, but we think it was cirrhosis of the liver. And he travelled to Lisbon, Portugal for his health, hoping the climate would restore him. But unfortunately, he died and is buried there. But a comedian to the last, he left behind a hilarious travel journal, which was published after his death.
I love 18th century travel journals. They're so much fun. Also, guidebooks of the 18th century. So, just tell me, what is the plot of Tom Jones?
Okay, so I'm going to give you some spoilers to convey a broad sense of the plot, but they're not the ones that I think would take away from your enjoyment of reading the novel. So the best
Good.
way to describe it is like a carry-on film where our hero, Tom Jones, shags his way through 1,000 pages. It's but
And I
saying that,
wonder, yeah, so this may be surprising for some of our listeners, especially if they have experience reading Jane Austen or reading the novels of the 19th century Victorian novels. So the Georgians were quite a rowdy bunch. And I think no novel maybe sort of encapsulates that better than Tom Jones.
and of course her
Big
reading wasn't censored,
sexcapade.
so she had access to everything that was in her father's library. So Tom Jones
Absolutely.
must have been in there, and he obviously didn't mind her reading that. And also, is it Samuel Richardson who wrote Sir Charles Grandison, which is quite risque, and apparently that was one of Austen's favourite novels as well. So, yeah, she was no prim and proper lady in her reading habits.
Absolutely not. Yes. And there was lots of yeah, she definitely had a more worldly view than maybe she would have expressed. And certainly go ahead, please. Tell us more about
So,
Tom Jones.
saying that about it is very rude and bawdy, but on the other hand, Tom Jones is also meticulously plotted. So Tom has lots of
Mm.
adventures, but because we're going to examining this through the lens of Austen, I want to focus on telling you about Tom's relationships with women. So the novel starts when Squire Allworthy returns home to Somerset, where he lives with his sister Miss Bridget, and he discovers a foundling, i.e., an abandoned baby in his bed, who later
Right.
becomes Tom Jones. So Allworthy's housekeeper accuses a maid, Jenny Jones, of being Tom's mother. And Jenny is brought before Squire Allworthy as the magistrate. So you can see some of Fielding's life crossing over to his art here. And Jenny confesses. And in his mercy, Allworthy decides to keep the baby and give Jenny some money to start a new life where somewhere that nowhere knows her crimes. And then Miss Bridget marries Captain Bliffle, and they have a son, Master Bliffle, and he's Allworthy's heir. But him and Tom are raised together as kind of cousins, and they're always fighting. And the family try and get them to get along together, but at one point, Bliffle calls Tom a beggarly bastard, and gets a punch in the nose for it. So you can see that Tom grows up a real rascal, but he's also
Mhm.
got this sense of honour, as Fielding's narrator says, it was the opinion of all who knew him that he was born to be hanged.
More because he gets himself into
Yeah,
misadventures, gets himself
trouble
into
all the
trouble,
time,
rather
all the
than out
time.
a sort of a criminal side of him or a desire to be
Well,
naughty.
yeah, he does things. So, for example, he poaches some uh, game on the neighbour Squire Weston's estate, um, and he gets caught poaching this game, which is a capital
Which
offence.
is super highly
Yeah,
illegal. Yeah,
yeah. It's a capital
yeah.
offence in the 18th century.
Oh,
And
right, yeah.
they try and get out of him who was with him, who gave him the gun. And Tom won't say because the gamekeeper gave him the gun. And it's one thing for Tom to get in trouble, but if they find out it's the gamekeeper, he'll lose his job, his home, and his whole family will be ruined. So you can see there that he's naughty. He's really naughty, Tom. He shouldn't have done the poaching. But on the other hand, he's a good man for not dobbing his
Yeah,
friend in.
honorable to
So
the end, for sure.
this Squire
Yeah.
Weston, whose land he poaches on, is the neighbour. And Squire Weston has a daughter, Sophia, who's around the same age as Tom and Bliffle. And poor Sophia falls in love with Tom because he's handsome, sporty, charming, and as we've just heard, he's a real gallant as well. Tom doesn't notice Sophia because he's too busy seducing his friend, the gamekeeper's daughter, Molly. And it turns out that Molly is with child. Just after this,
Oh,
and she
Tom.
says that Tom's the father. Just
Right.
after this, Tom breaks his arm saving Sophia's life in a riding accident and is forced to live with the Westons until he recovers. And while he's there, he forgets about Molly and begins to return Sophia's affections. And then realizing he'd rather pursue Sophia, Tom tries to pay Molly off, but he finds her in bed with another man. And Molly's sister tells him he wasn't her original seducer, and there's only a 50-50 chance that he's the father of Molly's unborn baby, which I think is still high enough for him to assume responsibility. But this is an 18th century novel, and it's a little bit different in their eyes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a place where the novel shows its age a little bit, I think.
Mm,
That
mm, mm.
yeah,
But
that you
saying
don't
that, Molly's
necessarily
not
have.
portrayed as a victim. She's very much kind of in control of her actions. But yeah, it's where the story would be slightly different if Austen was telling it, I think.
Yes. Yes, or yes, for sure.
So so Sophia and Tom are in love, but Squire Weston doesn't know that, and Sophia's aunt confuses her crush with Blifil, who is the heir. And between them, the two squires arrange a match between Blifil and Sophia, which is very financially savvy because they're heirs to adjacent properties. But Sophia refuses to marry Blifil, and she and Tom admit to being in love. And at this point, all hell breaks loose, and Squire Weston accuses Tom of trying to steal away Sophia. So note the language here. Again, this is where we really see the 18th century ideas at work. It's steal away Sophia because she is an heiress. So seducing her is tantamount to stealing property.
Yes.
So Squire
Yeah.
Allworthy turns Tom out to make his own way in the world. And in a totally Wentworth move, Tom resolves to go to sea. But on the way there, he meets a company of soldiers at an inn and decides to volunteer for the army. And it's while he's drinking with the soldiers that Tom raises a toast to Sophia. But one of the soldiers, Norbiton, insults her by responding, "Oh, Sophia Weston. Yeah, we all know Sophia Weston." So apparently that joke is as old as time. So Tom defends his sweetheart's honour, but he's wounded when Norbiton throws a bottle at his head. And at that point, Tom is wearing a white coat, which becomes drenched in blood. And I want you to remember this white coat, Elizabeth, for when we talk about Austen later.
Okay,
So
white coat drenched in blood. I'm going to remember that.
Norbiton is arrested for wounding Tom, but he escapes. And Tom continues on his travels through the English countryside. And while passing through some woods, he runs to the assistance of a lady being attacked. Now, this being an 18th century novel, of course, the attacker turns out to be Norbiton, who
Because
escapes again.
18th century novels are, and 19th century too, there's a lot of coincidences, world sort of overlap and characters overlap in different scenarios that you can expect them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're
Coincidences
back to
which we would not
Norbiton.
be allowed to get away with today,
No,
but
absolutely not.
make the novels brilliant all the same.
Yeah.
So Norbiton escapes, but Tom and the lady go to an inn where they spend all night shagging. Meanwhile, Squire Weston has been trying to force Sophia to marry Blifil, and to avoid this, she runs away and arrives at the very same inn. But instead of going home, and she finds out Tom is in bed with Mrs. Walters. Poor Sophia.
Ah, the woman that he rescued.
Mhm.
Oh, poor Sophia.
So broken-hearted, she runs away again. But instead of going home and submitting, she and her maid, Mrs. Honor, decide to go to London to Lady Bellaston, who's a friend of the family. But Lady Bellaston is not to be trusted. And when Tom pursues Sophia to London, Lady Bellaston conceals Sophia and somehow manages to make Tom her kept man. So she showers him with gifts and seduces him. And it turns out she despises Sophia. So behind her back, she calls her a country idiot, which is quite an insult. So
Terrible.
when Tom and Sophia eventually bump into each other, he does some masterful emotional manipulation to convince her that he hasn't been unfaithful really, well not in his heart, although at this point he clearly has with his in his body with let me see, Molly, Mrs. Waters, and Lady Bellaston.
Right.
Lady Bellaston tries to get Sophia out of the way by marrying her off, but Squire Weston arrives and ruins that plan by being so disagreeable in front of her suitor. And Tom realizes he needs to get out of the arrangement with Lady Bellaston, and that ironically, the best way to do this might be by proposing marriage, because then all her fortune and the power in their relationship would revert to him. So he sends her a letter with his proposal, to which Lady Bellaston replies, I see what you're doing, and I hate you from my very soul. So good, isn't it? And
It's
out
so
of
good.
spite, Lady Bellaston shows this letter to Sophia. Meanwhile, Tom bumps into Mrs. Walter's lover and they get into a duel, and Tom gets arrested for injuring him. Again, it's a potentially fatal wound, so things could go very bad for Tom. But when Mrs. Walters goes to see Tom in jail, it turns out that she is, in fact, the lady formerly known as Jenny Jones, the maid who confessed to being Tom's mother. But don't
Oh
panic. Don't
no.
panic. Don't panic. It's not as bad as it seems. And Jenny reveals who she actually is and what part she played in his birth. But I'm not going to tell you about that because I don't want to spoil it for you. But just
Right.
know that she's instrumental in getting Tom out of jail. And Mrs. Walters' lover is fine. He recuperates, and all charges are dropped. And at this point, when the secret of who Tom's real parents are is revealed, Tom is reconciled with Allworthy, who makes Tom his heir over Blifil. And hearing this, Squire Weston suddenly becomes as eager for Tom to marry his daughter as he was previously for Blifil to marry her. So Tom and
Because
Sophia make up.
yeah,
I think he's got the money. So
yeah, of
Tom and
course.
Sophia make up, and it's happily ever after, or maybe happy for now.
Right. We'll see. Well, we won't see, but we can maybe guess whether Tom continues to be faithful in his heart only, or if he decides to also be faithful
Mm,
in his body.
that's
But
the
again,
question,
there's another area.
because
Yeah,
they are
that's where
different,
the
Tom.
they are different, but the novel is 300 years old almost, and there was a different time. And I think maybe in 18th century sensibilities, there was such a thing as being faithful in one's heart
No,
versus
I
being
don't know. I
faithful.
don't know. I don't know. I think that's a
Well, yeah.
masterful piece of emotional manipulation on Tom's part, which is the difference in reading it. We're reading it through Henry Fielding, who we know from his life story wasn't a saint and definitely enjoyed all life's pleasures. And yeah, it's different to see what Austen would think of that.
Mind you, this book was written at a time when King George II, King of England, tells his dying queen on her deathbed, when he has his mistresses, in the palace with him as well. He tells his dying queen not to worry. He will not marry again. He will merely console himself by taking more mistresses once she dies. And this was
Just what every
actually,
lady wants
again,
to hear.
exactly. But the funny thing is that if we try to view that from an 18th century perspective, there's actually some comfort to that. She was the Queen of England, and he's saying, nobody but you will be my queen.
Okay,
So I don't know.
I might let him get away with it, but I'm not sure about Tom. But saying
Yes,
that,
fair enough. Fair enough.
I do think the novel is absolutely worth reading today,
Yes.
because it's so funny, and because the language is quite straightforward, and it's fairly easy to read, and Fielding's turn of phrase is just so brilliant. Um, so all those things kind of balance out the different attitudes. And as you can tell, like I couldn't resist quoting him in places because he's just so funny. Like he's just
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
erudite. And it's very rude and it's very broady, but it's also an excellent insight into 18th century attitudes, into crime and sin and morality and charity. And it's just really thought provoking. And Tom
Hmm.
is genuinely likable. Don't get me wrong, you can't read this novel without feeling losing your heart a little bit to Tom Jones. And what's so wonderful about it is that the female characters have real agency. So even Sophia has got real spirit. She's got a really touching female friendship with her maid, Mrs. Honor, and it might even pass the Bechdel test. And it's really lovely to know that Austen's family had a kind of in joke where they would compare her to Sophia. So apparently they looked a little bit alike in the description of Sophia, and they thought she had some of Sophia's spirit. But it is incredibly long. It's a really, really long novel. I've got a copy here. So here we go. It's 1,000
Yep.
pages. So you might want to choose an abridged version or skip the rambling essays in some of the chapters. Um, and I've been thinking about this with Austen. So here's her books, and here's one of Mansfield Park, which I think is her second longest book, and it's about half as long as Tom Jones. And I've been thinking about this
Right.
in terms of the way that she published. So Fielding had a traditional publisher who paid him for what he delivered, so he could deliver a great big piece and get paid for it. But Austen, paid for her books to be produced through her brother's Henry's contacts, Thomas Egerton, who ran a military press. So she um, and Henry, her brother, absorbs the cost of producing them and had to turn a profit on them. So I wonder if, in a way, her mode of publishing, which is a kind of hybrid self publishing, is
Hmm.
responsible for her incredible succinctness. So she famously lopped and cropped her novels. So, and do we have the mode of publishing that she used to deliver her books to thank for the fact that her novels are really as long as the novels that we read today, which is quite striking for a novel of the
Yes, and I
time.
think really adds to their readability still 200 years later that
Mm,
that she did that.
mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, she didn't have the luxury of going off and like essays about, you know, crime and morality. She's going to stick to the story.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Um, so in terms of how best to enjoy Tom Jones, I'm a big audiobook fan. So the first time I read it, I listened to the Penguin audiobook, which is narrated by Robert Lindsay, which is just over 7 hours. So really
And that's
succinct.
an abridged
Yeah.
version? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But it's really funny because it doesn't seem to have missed much out. Every time I flick through the book, I
Hmm.
find a bit from the audiobook. But perhaps more excitingly, you can now watch, and Elizabeth and I have just binged the PBS Masterpiece series starring Solly McLeod and Sophie Wilde. Um, so the new beautiful adaptation of Tom Jones, which is available in the UK from ITV now.
Yeah, and they did some really we won't go into that one, but they did some really interesting creative things with the characterization in that miniseries. It was really, really lovely. I just wanted
Yeah,
to say before I ask you, I wanted to ask you a different question, but you mentioned earlier how well plotted Tom Jones is, and when you were going over the plot summary, I couldn't help but think how you could take something like Save the Cat for those of our listeners who might be writers themselves, or your 3 act structure, your basic 3 act structure, and apply it to Tom Jones.
yeah,
A lot
yeah,
of the benchmarks are there. Just they jumped out at me during your summary. It's really interesting how these very, very early novels, and Tom Jones was an early novel. It was the genre or the medium was kind of still in its infancy at the time, but how
yeah.
we still have the same plot structure
Yeah,
300 years
it's
later.
really well paced. I mean, it's definitely a
Yeah.
dark night of the soul when he finds out that Jenny Jones is Mrs. Waters.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
then the finale
I
kind of
can.
gallops away. So yeah,
Right.
I think that would be an
Absolutely. And you've got the
interesting.
break into two. You've got the two
Yeah,
act where Thomas sent out
yeah,
into the world
catalyst
to
where
make
he's
his
gonna
own.
go.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And even the
that's
save the
the
cat
thought.
bit at the beginning where he helps out the gamekeeper.
Yeah,
That's our way. Fielding's way of telling us this guy, he's gonna get into some trouble. He's gonna be a little bit naughty, but you know that in his core he's good. He's a worthy protagonist, and you're all going to care about him. So
that's
that's
a
one of the
very good
things I
point.
love. Yeah, you can do that too with Austen, of course. Austen was the master, but I love
Because
that.
most 18th century novels, I don't think you can, which is why it's so difficult for us to read them today. But this feels like a novel. It feels like a real hero's journey where he's coming of age and he's got to go through all these
Hmm.
things and everything comes full circle, even though it's so long. So yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
point. It is
yeah.
those modern plot benchmarkers are still there, aren't they?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Absolutely. So, just how do we know that Jane Austen read Tom Jones?
So this is the exciting bit because in Austen's surviving letters, there are two absolutely delicious snippets where she directly compares Tom Lefroy, who was obviously her sweetheart for a very brief period when she was in her late teens. I think she was 19, 20 when she met Tom Lefroy, to Fielding's hero, Tom Jones. So remember what I told you about the colour of Tom Jones' coat.
It was a white coat, got
It was a
drenched
white
in
coat. It
blood.
was a white coat. So
Yeah.
this is a letter to Cassandra on the 9th of January, 1796, talking about Tom Lefroy. He has but one fault, which time will, I trust, entirely remove. It is that his morning coat is a great deal too light. He is a very great admirer of Tom Jones, and therefore wears the same coloured clothes, I imagine, he did when he was wounded. No, I know.
Uh,
You can see, where at the what kind of a pedestal she's putting Tom Lefroy up on there. And then,
yeah.
just 5 days later, on the 14th of January, she writes to Cassandra. I'd rather expect to receive an offer from my friend over the course of the evening. I shall refuse him, however, unless he promises to give away his white coat.
Dreadful white coat. Yeah. Can't be married to a Tom Jones.
Absolutely, her standards were high. Um,
Good.
So I can just imagine that one of the things that Austen and Tom Lefroy had in common was their shared love of literature. And Tom Jones is the perfect novel for them to have bonded over because obviously
Hmm.
Fielding was a lawyer and a magistrate, and his novel is deeply concerned with these ideas of crime and punishment, which must have really appealed to a law student, Tom Lefroy.
Do you think that Tom Jones influenced Jane Austen's work at all?
I do, but I think she was kind of writing against that tradition. So I
Hmm.
think she must have really, really appreciated Fielding's satirical humour. So, but saying that, it, Tom Jones is exactly the kind of rake that she would later warn against in the form of George Wickham, John Willoughby, Henry Crawford, etc. So he is
Of course.
charming, he's handsome, and he's a seducer, which is great to read about, but to a young woman who lets down her guard could easily spell ruin. So the reason I
Absolutely.
question the happily ever after at the end of Tom Jones is because I've got absolutely zero confidence that Tom will remain faithful to Sophia. And she actually says herself, um, how can I be confident in the security of my future happiness with a man of such, capable of such inconsistencies? But Tom wins
Yes.
her over. And here's another example of his emotional manipulation. So he shows her herself in the mirror and he says, look at yourself. You're so beautiful. It would be impossible for anyone to be unfaithful to you. To me, that feels like a total Henry Crawford move. So
Hmm.
I feel like Austen read this novel and really enjoyed it and took away the humour and the plotting. And it must have struck her how different things would be from the heroine's point of view. And that was her incredible gift, was taking a story, and making the young woman the heroine of it. So making us young women, well, making women the heroine of their own
Hmm.
stories. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. And I think they also share this interest in morality versus propriety. So in Tom Jones, there's a real tension between what's criminal or sinful versus what's morally right or wrong. So we've talked about when Tom is caught poaching on his neighbour's land. Um, he, is it right? I mean, it's criminally, it's wrong for him to withhold the information
Right.
about who gave him the gun, but morally, is it wrong or right for him to do that? And I think with Austen, it's the same kind of idea, but what she's playing with is what's socially acceptable or lawful versus what's morally right or wrong. And I'm thinking particularly of the opening scene of Sense and Sensibility, where Fanny Dashwood effectively steals the Dashwood sisters' inheritance by prevailing on her husband not to impoverish their poor son. And it's all perfectly
Yeah.
legal, but how would we classify her actions morally?
Yes. Yes. And that's done so brilliantly in the 1990s version of Sense and Sensibility, where the screenplay was written by Emma Thompson.
Yeah, and the
That
actress who
that
played Fanny Dashwood is Harriet Water, who is a dame now, and I think she must have been awarded that damehood on the strength of that scene because it's
it's
fantastic.
brilliant. Her performance in general in that film was absolutely amazing. Jess, how has Tom Jones influenced your work, or has it?
Um, yes, in a general sense, because it's a perfectly plotted mystery. So I
Hmm.
really love the 18th, 19th century sense of a novel as a puzzle where all the strands come together at the end to provide the solution. Um, and this was done so well in Tom Jones, and it's always what I'm striving
Yes,
to achieve in my work. So when the twist was revealed at the end of Tom Jones, I actually started reading it again from the beginning because it felt so inevitable, and yet I'd never spotted it. So I was
right.
looking at the beginning to see if the clues were actually there, and they were. They just delivered so perfectly that I didn't realise. So yes, in that general sense of it being a mystery and me trying to understand how mysteries work, and then also in a very specific way. So I love this idea of a young Tom Lefroy and Jane Austen using their shared love of literature to flirt with each other, and this novel in particular. And I can totally imagine Jane opening a conversation with Tom Lefroy by roasting him about his white coat. I'm 100% sure that was her line. So in my debut novel, Miss Austen Investigate, um, it opens with a young Tom Lefroy and Jane Austen at a ball where she's hoping that Tom Lefroy will propose, but their romance is interrupted when the body of a milliner is found bludgeoned to death. And Jane sets out to solve the murder because she knew and respected the young woman. And then when her brother is accused of the crime, and all throughout my story, Jane and Tom use Tom Jones to flirt with each other.
Hmm.
So, for example, Mr. Lefroy leaves secret letters for Jane addressed to Miss Weston in case they're intercepted. But my Jane, with her astute intelligence, does note from the start that Mr. Lefroy really should have chosen a more constant hero to emulate in Fielding's Tom Jones.
Really should have. Maybe he learned. Maybe he learned later on.
Wow.
But it
Well
was too
said.
late for him and Jane.
Hmm.
So, if any of our listeners want, when your book comes out in February, I think it is, they
January,
can
end of
look.
January. Yeah.
January,
At the
January.
moment,
Okay.
it might move.
Um, yeah, yeah, they can look for those specific references to Tom Jones. That's quite
Look for
exciting.
the little nuggets of Tom Jones.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
you, Elizabeth, read Evelina by Fanny Burney. So, first of all, tell me who was Fanny Burney?
All right. Well, I adore Frances Burney. Like it's a little bit of a mission in my life to get her to be more well known than she is. I think she deserves to be. She was born in 1752. She's only 23 years older than Jane Austen. She was the daughter of a musician who wrote music for the London theatre. So Frances Burney grew up closely connected to the theatrical world. David Garrick and Richard Sheridan, Brinsley Sheridan were family friends. She frequently attended the theater and the opera. Those were her first loves. Like Fielding, she was a dramatist at heart. She'd watch a show, she'd return home to create more dialogue for the characters. So she was writing early fan fiction as well. She wrote Juvenilia, which she later destroyed. But we know that amongst her early writings was a novel that was telling the tragic story of Caroline Evelyn, in which influences of Samuel Richardson, his Clarissa can be seen. So you talked about Samuel Richardson earlier. You talked about Pamela, his another one of his books, Clarissa, does not have the happy ending that. Sorry, my error.
She does Clarissa kind of come to a sticky
But
end because she wasn't as
yeah,
virtuous as Pamela?
Well, no, she was very, very virtuous, but she comes to a sticky end. So maybe we can talk about that at another time. But so Clarissa is a tragedy, and Burney first was influenced by that. She wrote a tragedy when she was young, her juvenilia. But when she later published her first novel, which was Evelina, it isn't a tragedy, but it was still a sequel, sort of a sequel to the early tragedy that she'd written. She changed the tragic ending for a happy one, which was a fairly original concept in a female-centric novel at the time, and something that directly influenced Jane Austen. Jane Austen's famous quote, I'm going to say here because I think it really speaks to the happy ending and how important that was to Jane and also to Frances Burney. Jane says, "My characters shall have, after a little trouble, all that their hearts desire." It was one of the things that makes us all so happy when we read Jane Austen. Was a very empowering thing for female readers at the time because, unlike Richardson's Clarissa, whose victimization destroyed her, Burney and Austen's heroines navigated society and men, and they emerged victorious. So I love that. I think it's really important
Yeah,
to
there was
keep in
something
mind
to
how
aim for there. A very
significant,
satisfying
yes.
end to a story, and also a positive role model to aspire to.
Hmm. Hmm. Frances Burney published her first novel, Evelina, anonymously. She didn't do that with her later ones, but she did with her first. She didn't even want to tell her father that she'd written it. It was published in 1778, but it received positive reviews immediately. It was followed 4 years later by her second novel, which was Cecilia, or Memoirs of an Heiress. So Burney lived a much had a much wider social sphere than Jane Austen. In fact, she was a close friend of Queen Charlotte of recent Bridgerton fame, the wife of George III. She became Keeper of the Robes to Queen Charlotte in 1786, and she was a part of the King and Queen's inner circle, their very close family inner circle, in fact, during the King's first severe bout of madness in 1788.
And isn't it
She her
through some of her diaries that we actually know, we get a glimpse into that time, what was going on in the royal court?
I think so, or from some of her letters, yes. Um, but in fact, at court was difficult for Frances Burney. Not so much being in service of the Queen as the other people at court. I can imagine it would be a very challenging sort of environment to navigate. So she left the service of the Queen in 1791 due to a prolonged illness with no particular definition. The moment she left the court, her illness got better. So I would feel like maybe anxiety or other sort of.
Stress, extenuating that suffering.
But due to her service, she received an annuity of £100 for the rest of her life, which is the equivalent of about £10,000 a year in today's money. So not enough to live on, but like a nice, comfortable little bit to for sort of pocket money to help her along. She
Oh,
met
what Jane
and
Austen would have
married.
done for that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So Frances Burney was much more successful than Jane Austen. I mean, her social circle was a more elevated one, and definitely her writings too. She made a lot more. I think Jane Austen in her lifetime made £600 in total off of her writings. Frances Burney, by comparison, made 4,000. I'll talk about what that's equivalent to later. And Maria Edgeworth, another and similar writer, contemporary, I think made about 10,000 in
Wow.
her lifetime, which is more or
Wow.
less equivalent to $1 million in today, or money, £1 million. Sorry, my Canadianism. Definitely not $1 million Canadian. That is a very different thing from £1 million. So anyway, Frances Burney met and married the exiled Frenchman Alexandre d'Arblay. He was an adjutant general of the Marquis de Lafayette, for the Hamilton fans amongst our listeners. And she had one son, also named Alexander, who was born in 1794. So when she wrote and published her second novel, Camilla, 1796, that one, after the success of Evelina, she actually sold for £1,000, which is the equivalent of
Incredible.
roughly £100,000 in today's money. So if she were to have a bookseller entry, Frances Burney has sold in a six-figure deal, this novel coming out, expected for publication at such a date. So
Deal
it
of
was
the
it was a
week.
great deal. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And with that money, 1,000 pounds, she bought a cottage in Surrey, which she named Camilla Cottage after her book. But Jess, I have to ask
Dreams.
you, yeah, would £100,000 of today's money buy a cottage in Surrey?
No, I think you need a
Like, yeah,
million at least, and even then it would be a
yeah.
very small cottage. So it's very,
So
very posh.
we have to remember when we're making equivalencies between money then and money now that you actually can't compare them equally at any point because things had different value. For example, a candle had a completely different value from candles today. A horse had a different value. You don't really have the same um, you can't say, well, a book cost this then and a book costs this now, and therefore we can compare them because to make a book then was a much more expensive process, for example. So I think probably, although technically this was £100,000 in today's money, I think it probably meant even more.
It is a
I think it was
substantial sum.
probably
It's life changing amount of
substantial.
money to,
Absolutely.
to be able
Absolutely.
to buy a house outright. I mean, think of all those
Absolutely.
years that Jane had to, after her father died, or even after when, the Stevenson Rectory was handed over to James, all those years when she didn't have a home, and to be, if it was dreams, absolute like author dreams, to be able to write a book which is so successful that your publisher gives you enough money to buy your own home outright and name it after the book.
I know. And we all would too if we could. It doesn't happen to many of us, though. Anyway, in the early 19th century, Fanny Burney moved between England and the continent with some frequency. And during those years, she very famously underwent a mastectomy without anesthetic, which she wrote about in unflinching detail in a letter, which is now in the British Library. She published her fourth and final novel, The Wanderer or Female Difficulties, for £2,000, so twice what she had sold Camilla for, and she bandaged the wounded at the Battle of Waterloo. She was sort of everywhere and around everybody who was important in her lifetime. After her husband's death in 1818, she returned to England. She remained there for the rest of her life. She didn't die until 1840. She was an astonishing 88 years old. In her lifetime, she'd been friends with some of the greatest entertainers, novelists, political leaders, and sort of important people of the day, as I said, including Queen Charlotte, Sam Johnson, David Garrick, Richard Sheridan, Sir Walter Scott, the diarist Hester Thrall. So, who was Frances Burney? She was a risk taker, she was a satirist, she was a student of dialogue and idiom, and she was an immensely brilliant woman who lived a remarkable life.
She really was. She sounds absolutely
Yeah.
incredible. It's so
Hmm.
sad that her memory doesn't live on in the same way that her contemporaries do. So you mentioned she was
Yeah.
in the court of Queen Charlotte, and she was, her husband was part of Alexander Hamilton's regiment, but she's not there in the
Well, the
record.
Marquis de Lafayette, but
Oh,
yes.
sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. No, that's all
So,
right.
yep, in the part of the Marquis de Lafayette's regiment. Um, but it's such a shame that she hasn't found her way into the popular consciousness in the way that these other figures have.
Yeah.
So,
But, maybe we can change that a little
yeah,
bit at a time.
yeah, well, we're doing it today. So tell
Yes.
me, what is the plot of Evelina?
Okay, so I'm going to give you Frances Burney's own words when she pitched the idea to her publisher, because writers then pitched ideas to publishers and agents just like we do today. This is what she said. She wanted to write a novel that was the introduction of a well educated but inexperienced young woman into public company, that she would go round for a round of the most fashionable spring diversions of London. I believe it has not yet before been executed, though it seems a fair, open field for a novelist, as it offers a fund inexhaustible for conversation, observations, and probable incidents. I adore this quote so much
Perfect
because
query letter,
Frances
isn't it?
yeah, it is, right? It really is. She is so prophetic here, though. She is right on two accounts. One, it hadn't been attempted before. She was the originator of this. And two, is the novels of Jane Austen, Georgette Hare, Bridgerton, and the still going strong genre of Regency romance has shown us. It is indeed a fund inexhaustible for conversation, observations, and probable incidents. Romance readers never tire of it, and you can sort of do it in countless different ways. So, as I said earlier, Evelina was first published in January of 1778. It was an instant success. Some of Regency romance's favorite settings for love scenes and misadventures were first written here, most notably the pivotal ball scenes and a scene set at Vauxhall Gardens. Like all romances, the plot has twists and turns and a number of unlikely coincidences that are often found in 18th and 19th century novels. Like we talked about with Tom Jones, that's extremely outmoded now. I shan't delve into all the twists which caused trouble for Evelina on her path to happiness, but rather touch on the essence of the plot, which would be familiar to any romance reader today, but at the time was quite novel, pun intended, in its happy ending. So, Evelina is a young, virtuous, well educated, and naive beauty. By a cruel twist of fate, she is left rather penniless. She's brought up in the country. She is the dutiful ward to an elderly vicar who loves her like her daughter, and her sweetness and goodness commend her to her social superiors. And therefore, she has the good fortune to be invited to go to London to enjoy the fashionable season. So off Evelina goes. She's giddy, but measured. No Lydia Bennet here.
So again, that's the
And
perfect
she
catalyst, isn't it? The inciting incident that kicks her off on her
absolutely,
journey.
yes, yes, and new world for Evelina. Yeah, you can definitely see the save the cat here too. I get so
Or as
excited
Austen would
about
put it, was it if Lady can't find any adventures in her own village, she must seek them abroad.
she must. Yeah. So she's gone off to enjoy the splendors of town. But almost at once, she meets a young gentleman, Jess, who is far superior in every way to any young gentleman she has ever met before. And his name is Lord Orville. And I think this is significant because even in originating the rom com, which I think Frances Burney did, Frances Burney knew the importance of introducing the love interest readily so that readers could begin to fall in love with him as
Get
well.
him in there. Show us
Get
what
him in there.
we're aiming for. Show us the
What
prize.
what's the end game here? Yeah. So Evelina and Lord Orville's meet cute is at a ball where he asks her to dance, but poor Evelina, due to her ignorance of town customs and her shyness at finding herself dancing with such a young man, and Lord no less, as she discovers, she inadvertently doesn't make a good first impression on Lord Orville.
Oh, this
So,
sounds a
in
bit
fact,
familiar.
doesn't it? Yes, in a scene which will be so familiar to anybody who's read Pride and Prejudice, where we can absolutely see the direct influence of Frances Burney on Jane Austen, who wrote her famous ball scene, decades later. In this scene, Evelina's friend overhears Lord Orville call Evelina a poor, weak girl. Although he says he doesn't
Ouch.
know, I know it's brutal, whether that's because she's ignorant or mischievous. He's not certain on that. And unlike Darcy, he does say some nice things about her, but overall, it doesn't matter because Evelina is devastated by this. It's her first attempt at fashionable society. She's bungled it, and handsome Lord Orville will never think of her again.
Oh,
Absolutely devastating. But that's just the start of the adventure, with many more to follow as Orville and Evelina will meet again and again at the opera, at the pleasure gardens, upon the fashionable walks. And of course, villains will make their villains, because that will also sound familiar to you. The villains come in the form of boorish, uncouth relatives,
oh.
handsome, devilish rakes with no good intentions towards a beautiful and penniless girl, and also in the form of Lord Orville's snobbish family and friends.
Ouch.
So some direct influences on Pride and Prejudice there as
It
well.
sounds like it's got the
Evel-
real cringe factor that
yeah,
that
oh, definitely,
Austen
yes.
enjoyed as well.
Evelina will seemingly lose everything before she and Lord Orville achieve their perfect happiness, but achieve it they will. Everything is tied up beautifully in the end. No terrible hardship befalls any character, even the less than amiable ones. All in all, it's pure joy. The plot was an instant success, and it still is today. It can be told over and over again. For those who love the rom-com will never tire of its different iterations, the same story. And I think we have Frances Burney to thank for that.
She did well. She did well. So her memory
She
does
really
live
did.
on
Yeah,
in the heart of all these novels and these films that we still enjoy. Oh,
absolutely. Even in contemporary romance, you can see the influences. A lot of people will say that Evelina was the first rom-com ever written. Yeah.
so bearing that in mind, is
hmm
Evelina still worth reading today?
Well, I mean, I would say yes, but but I will admit she's the book is not nearly as accessible as Jane Austen's novels. I'd recommend it for anybody who's interested in exploring Austen's influences, or for anyone who's already accustomed to the style and the language of 18th century or even 19th century novels. If you read these comfortably in general, you won't have problem reading Evelina. But for those who maybe don't enjoy that so much, like with Fielding, you get long descriptions of plays and discussions of characterizations the characters sort of engage with. There are also lots of references to things a modern reader wouldn't understand unless they know the history of the time very, very well. I myself, when I read it, find myself flipping to the footnotes. And because Frances Burney was a student of language and idiom and speech patterns, sort of in the style of George Bernard Shaw, there's a lot of that will escape a modern reader or a non-British reader for sure. There's also a little bit of unpalatable snobbiness about the lower classes. So keeping all that in mind,
And some
really, I
problematic anti-French sentiment as
there
well.
is that too. Yes,
Mm.
yeah. Yeah, although Frances Burney herself married a
She
Frenchman. So
did, she did. And
yeah,
it's the characters who are anti-French who she is satirizing. So
that
she's,
is true.
using that to demonstrate that they are monsters in a way. But it's
Right. And
quite shocking to read that kind of xenophobia in a novel today.
yes, absolutely. Especially if you don't realize, which, again, a modern reader might not realize right away, if you don't realize what Frances Burney there was doing there in commenting
Yeah.
on that, as you said, that xenophobia. So in an ideal world, what I'd really love to see is a sort of BBC Masterpiece Theatre Andrew Davies version of this that's designed to make it more sort of accessible and palatable to a modern audience, but with absolutely lush 18th century costumes.
Oh, it'd be so
Because
good.
in truth, yeah, as the first rom-com ever written, I think that it really does deserve its place. And it would be nice for a wider audience to experience the works which influenced Austen, especially those works that influenced her so very directly.
Yeah. Perhaps one day when we've got a break in our schedules that we'll put our heads together and
Yeah,
see if we can come up with a screenplay.
absolutely. That would, don't tempt me.
But in the meantime, as I said, I'm a huge audiobook fan, and on Audible there is a version of Evelina which is partly narrated by Dame Judi Dench, and I listened to that one
Oh,
and found it very
oh,
accessible. Quite
nice.
long, but very
Okay,
accessible.
good, good.
Yeah.
Good for our listeners
So
to know.
how do
Perfect.
we know that Jane read Evelina?
Okay, well, she readily admits being a massive fan of Frances Burney. In fact, historian Lucy Worsley, whose biography of Jane is one of my favorites, she calls Burney Jane's favorite novelist. And what a thing to be the favorite novelist of someone who is quite possibly now the world's favorite novelist. I love that. Also, in Northanger Abbey, Jane writes a passage which will be familiar to many of our listeners, in which she defends the novel. And in that passage, she directly names three novels. They are Burney's Cecilia, Burney's Camilla, and Maria Edgeworth's Belinda.
So
And the
two
way
out
Jane
of the
describes
three are Burney's.
Two of the three are Burney's. And the way Jane writes about that is she says, a novel is a work in which the greatest powers of mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, and the liveliest infusions of wit and humor are, conveyed to the world in the best chosen language.
I
That
love
is
that bit.
just such a tremendous statement of praise from the brilliant Jane Austen. And if you're wondering why she didn't mention Evelina specifically in that quote, it was the oldest of Burney's works. By the time Jane Austen was writing Northanger Abbey, it was less in fashion than Burney's more recent novels. Just simply mentioning the two most popular Burney novels at the time in which she wrote that passage.
But what
In
a quote.
fact, we
Imagine
also
having
know.
that on your cover.
Yeah, we're really
Jane
what?
Austen
Oh, right.
says.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that would be something. But it should be done. Like these Oxford World Classics, they could have a
Oh,
Jane
yeah.
Austen quote right here. um,
Samuel
there.
Richardson says Shamala is an abomination.
Yeah, it's too funny. We know that Burney was a great favorite of the Austen household in general, not just Jane. She was Jane Austen's father's favorite novelist as well. Her books were read aloud for the family's entertainment in the evenings. Interestingly, when George Austen first sought to get Jane's novels published, the comp he gave to the publisher, because even then you gave comps to publishers, was Frances Burney. And also, by coincidence, Mr. Austen and Frances Burney are in fact buried together, and they're buried in the same churchyard in Bath. They're not buried together, but they are in the same churchyard.
Which is very moving when
It
you
is.
go
It
there
is.
and you see two of the people that had such an influence on Austen's life in the same place.
Absolutely.
So tell me, how did Evelina and Frances Burney more generally influence Jane's work?
Right. So, I mean, I think some of the influences can be seen when I gave the plot summary of Evelina, but basically, like Jane, Burney was a satirist who stuck to writing. So, she was a social satirist more than a political satirist. She stuck to writing within the sphere she knew. But being more worldly than Jane and being a part of Queen Charlotte's close inner circle, as well as a part of the music and theater community, hanging out with the celebrities of the day, because actors and actresses and stage managers were very much the celebrities that they really are today. She was closely connected with some of the most important figures of her day and for the entirety of her nearly 90-year life. So it might be one of the reasons why Burney's works are slightly less accessible than Jane's. Jane's smaller social sphere by necessity made her write a more closed world, one that is easier for us to identify with now
Mm.
than Burney, who is subtly commenting on so many things in her novels that Jane kind of doesn't bother with really. So, Jane herself admitted that Burney was an influence on her. The basic premise of Jane's books, the rom com plot, was originated by Burney, although admittedly, Jane perfected it, which is, I think, why Jane remains to this day much more accessible. One of the many reasons why she's more accessible to modern readers. You also talked about how, by necessity, having to um, crop and edit her books so much has also lent sort of
It's
an
so
accessibility
succinct.
to her books.
Mm.
Yeah. I chose Evelina for this talk rather than Cecilia, which is probably likely the greater influence on the most famous of Austen's works, Pride and Prejudice. I chose Evelina because it was the first of Burney's novels. And as I said, I believe, and many people do believe, it's the originator of the rom com genre. Now, Evelina is an epistolary novel, Jess, and an epistolary novel, as you know, but maybe some of our readers don't, is a novel that it consists entirely of letters in which the characters, they write back and forth to each other. So there are
I
no
know that, but
narrative
I
passages,
still can't pronounce it.
right? So, interestingly, Jane's first versions of her novels were also epistolary novels. So, Sense and Sensibility started off as an epistolary novel. Pride and Prejudice started off as an epistolary novel, which she
And Pride
called
and Prejudice
First
still has quite a lot of
Impressions.
letters in it, doesn't it?
It does,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yeah. And Evelina, as I said, was also an epistolary novel. However, Frances Burney never wrote another epistolary novel. Later on, she moved to writing narrative novels, and that was a decision also that Jane made before she published her books. Um, Interestingly, when Jane changed First Impressions from being an epistolary novel, she changed its name. Famously, she changed its name to Pride and Prejudice. That name is actually taken from Frances Burney's 1782 novel Cecilia. And this is the quote from Cecilia in which Pride and Prejudice features. And while I read this, I just want to ask our listeners to sort of think about why it is that Jane chose this particular thing to name her novel, because I think it's quite clear. So the quote is this: "The whole of this unfortunate business," said Dr. Lister, "has been the result of Pride and Prejudice. If to Pride and Prejudice you owe your miseries, so wonderfully is good and evil balanced, that to Pride and Prejudice you will also owe their termination." So what she's basically saying here, what Frances Burney is saying in this quote, of course, is that we have miseries that arise because of Pride and Prejudice, the characters, and then the same miseries are resolved also because of Pride and Prejudice, sort of flipped on its head. So it was perfect. It was a perfect name for First Impressions for
Sums
Darcy
up
and Elizabeth's story.
sums up
And
Austen's story perfectly.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And so I think it's also really telling the influence of Burney, that Austen started off writing epistolary novels just like Burney did, but she changed them to have a closer connection to their protagonist through a narrative style instead. And I absolutely agree. I prefer it myself, although I do read epistolary novels, and
That's why they feel so
and I
modern and
also enjoy
fresh
them.
as well, isn't it? Is that we've kind of moved away from that style. Um,
Absolutely.
so tell me, you write Regency romance, racy Regency romances under the name Felicity George. Tell me, has Evelina influenced your work?
So absolutely, unquestionably, yes. And anybody who's currently writing Regency romance has a can sort of draw back influences to Burning, whether they're aware of it or not. I think one of the main reasons that happens is because of Georgette Hare. As most Regency romance readers know, Georgette Hare was writing closed bedroom door Regency romances, and starting in the 1920s. Throughout much of the middle of the 20th century, she wrote many, many wonderful, delightful romance novels. Were extremely popular. Readers often assume that Georgette Hare was influenced mostly by Austen, and undoubtedly she was, but the slapstick and farce elements of Hare, which we see a lot more of in modern regencies, sort of silly things happening, like people being caught in rain, or carriages overturning, or people pretending to be highwaymen when they're not really, and those sorts of things. You don't actually see those in Austen. Well, maybe the Caught in the Rain you do, but you see those a lot in Burney,
The
who
outrageous farce is much more
the
in Burney, isn't it?
outrageous farce. Yeah,
So
Burney's
there's
farce
my
was
favorite bit
less
of
subtle.
my favorite part in Evelina is when she goes to Vauxhall Gardens and accidentally finds herself strolling around Vauxhall Gardens with two prostitutes. And of course, while she's in this company, bumps into Lord Orville, and it's so cringe and so funny, but it's way over the line. for Austen. Like her
Yeah,
cringe is so subtle and so contained, and this kind of outlandish, kind of almost physical slapstick, like you say, is much more Fanny Burney, isn't it?
it is. It's much more Fanny Burney, but you definitely see it in almost all of Georgette Hare's romances. And Georgette Hare is really the sort of grandmother of all of us that write modern, like the modern Regency romance writers, and even Julia Quinn, their Bridgerton style. Those influences really do come from Georgette Hare. And like Georgette Hare was she was a historian. She knew her Austen. She knew her time period in which she was writing, and unquestionably, Georgette Hare would have read Burney. So I would say that all Regency romance writers owe a debt of gratitude to Frances Burney. Personally, I adore her. I look to her as well as to Austen for the inspiration for my novels, and my own personal favorite character in my Regency romance series is John Tyrrell. He is the hero of book 3, which will be upcoming in April of 2024. He actually derives his name from Frances Burney's novel Camilla. It's my little homage to this brilliant novelist to whom all Janeites owe so much. Because even if a Jane Austen fan doesn't read Burney, Jane herself wouldn't have evolved in the same way as a novelist without the inspiration of Burney's novels, or the inspiration that Burney's novels provided. And
Mm.
Burney paving the way for something a little different, the happily ever after rom com.
Oh, and it's lovely as
Ah,
well because in Jane, she was such a generous writer, and I love that she had that influence and owned it and claimed it in terms of that passage in Northanger Abbey and with the title of Pride and Prejudice. She was very proud of her fellow novelists and thought that everyone who wrote those kind of novels deserves that kind of respect, especially her fellow women writers.
yes,
Which
and I, personally, as a novelist who absolutely recognizes that I owe a debt of gratitude to so many novelists who came before me, um, I find it gratifying. I find it comforting to know that even the great Jane Austen had her influences, that she leaned on fairly heavily. She was brilliant,
I think
and
she turned
also
to Fanny
she
Burney
relied
in the
on
same way that we turned to Austen. So she would have gone to Fanny
absolutely.
Burney Con.
Yes, she would have. She would have. Absolutely, she would have.
So
Yeah.
that brings us to the end of our talk today. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to hear from you on social media. So if you use the virtual JaneCon hashtag, then we'll be looking out for your tweets or on Instagram. So tell us what you think of Evelina and Tom Jones, and perhaps what you think makes Jane Austen stand out from her contemporaries. So I am novelist Jessica on Twitter and Jessica Ball novelist on TikTok and Instagram. And Elizabeth, you are.
I am Felicity George on Twitter, but I am at Elizabeth Welke, Welke on Instagram. I am Felicity George underscore romance.
Thank you so much for having us. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.